Welcome to Sengoku Daimyo's Chronicles of Japan. My name is Joshua, and this is episode 133, Reimagining Yamato. As the bells of Hokoji tolled, Oama and his wife Uno surveyed the construction ongoing in the Asuka Valley. Hordes of workers had been called up, and now they were working furiously towards the deadline of the new year. Where once stood the later Okamoto Palace of Takarahime, aka Oama's mother, Saimei Tenno, now the land was being prepared for a palace on a much grander scale. And just as the palace was being remade, Oama's thoughts went beyond the valley to the entire archipelago. His brother, Nakano Oe, had started something profound. Now here he was, helming the ship of state, and Oama had plans of his own, built upon his brother's ideas. He would build a new state, ensuring that the reforms that started back in 645 would continue for generations. Right, greetings everyone, and welcome back. As we dive in, let's recap where we are. So the year is now 673, and the fighting from the previous year, the Jinshin War, is over. Prince Oama and his Yoshino forces were victorious, and he is now poised to ascend the throne in the recently built palace of Kiyomihara in Asuka. He will be known to future generations by his posthumous name, Temmu Tenno. Oama would go ahead and continue to centralize the government under the continental model. That said, he would also pay a not insignificant amount of attention to local tradition as well. His reign would lead to the establishment of the first permanent capital city, Fujiwara-kyo. He is also credited with initiating the projects collecting various historical records, which culminated in the Kojiki and the Nihon Shoki, the very chronicles on which this podcast is based, both of which seem to have been designed specifically to promote the authority of the throne, specifically Oama and his descendants. Those descendants, the Temmu dynasty, would rule for almost a century, including 4 of the 8 official female sovereigns. Those 8 can become 10 if you count the unofficial Himiko and Okinaga Terashihime, aka Jingu Tenno. This dynasty would reign from the end of the Asuka period up through to the Nara period, and it would see the evolution of the Yamato state into the kingdom of Nihon, which is to say, the kingdom of Japan. The politics of this period were also quite something. It is during this coming period that we see the rise of the famous Fujiwara family, who would come to dominate the political landscape. We also see the continued contact with the mainland, with numerous trade goods coming over, many of which would be included in the famous Shosoin storehouse of Todaiji Temple in Nara. Buddhism would also thrive, with kokubunji or provincial temples being set up in a network around the archipelago. There was also the building of the famous Daibutsu or giant Buddha statue of Todaiji, and all of the monks that went to study in China coming back and bringing their own thoughts, starting up new sects, and Buddhism would flourish. Speaking of flourishing, so would art. The Man'yoshu would be published at this time, a collection of around 4,500 Japanese poems, or waka. Meanwhile, the court would also focus on continental styles of poetry as well. From this point on, not only do we have more evidence of what was happening through the written record, but the writing itself changed. Different Sinitic characters were borrowed solely for their sound to help spell out Japanese words. These would eventually be simplified and known as kana. The earliest use of these characters is known as Man'yo-gana, because so many are traced back to the Man'yoshu itself. They would eventually be standardized and simplified, becoming the hiragana and katakana we know and use today. But in 673, all of this was still on the horizon. So this is a great time to pause for a bit in our journey through the Chronicles and set the stage for the next incredibly transformative period in the archipelago by going over these larger patterns in some depth, so that as we start to go through this period, we get a better idea of just what was happening and perhaps why. So that's what we'll do this episode. Now to start with, let's go back to the relationship between Nakano Oe and Oama. As far as we can tell, these brothers were fairly close to one another. Not only was Oama married to one of Nakano Oe's daughters, Princess Uno, he had actually taken as consort at least 4 of Nakano Oe's other daughters, all of which were Oama's nieces. In turn, one of Oama's own daughters, Princess Tochi, had been married off to Otomo, aka the ill-fated Kobun Tenno. On top of that, Nakano-Oe and Oama both had taken as consorts daughters of Sogono Akae, and both Otomo and Oama had consorts from Nakatomi, or Fujiwara no Kamatari. This demonstrates just how interrelated everyone was at court, presumably as a means of strengthening the ties between them. Of course, as we've seen time and again, those ties were more symbolic than anything else and certainly did not prevent the occasional use of violence, nor did it protect the fathers of those women from political repercussions when they found themselves on the wrong side. On the other hand, beyond the initial mention of their births, we don't see the two brothers together until Nakano-Oe came to the throne. So why is that? Well, to be fair, we don't see much of anyone but the sovereign in the Chronicles unless there's a specific thing they're called out for, like an embassy presenting something to the throne, etc. Even Nakano-Oe often isn't mentioned directly, even when he was the crown prince and supposedly helping run the government. So, could just be that. It is good to remind ourselves just how many people are not showing up in our narrative and how many people we just have to kind of make assumptions about based on what we know was going on around at the time. Now, there are two apparent counter-arguments to the idea that Nakano-Oe and his brother Oama were pretty tight. First is a mention in the Toshi Kaden, the family history of the Fujiwara family, about Oama thrusting a spear into a board at some kind of party, which rattled Nakano-Oe enough that he was apparently wondering if he needed to have his own brother taken out. Then there is Oama's resignation at the time of Nakano-Oe's death, presumably because he was warned that a plot was afoot and that if he accepted Nakano-Oe's offer to take the reins of state in his own two hands, then something, we aren't told what, would unfold. I can't rule out the idea that neither of those accounts is quite accurate either. It is possible that the Toshi Kaden account is embellished to heighten Fujiwara no Kamitare's own role as peacemaker between the brothers. I also have to wonder if the warning to Oama around Nakano-Oe's death wasn't so much about Nakano-Oe, but about his ministers. After all, they seem to have had no problem supporting the much younger and likely more malleable Prince Otomo. So it does seem possible to me that there were other threats that Oama was concerned with. And that brings me to one of those ministers, Nakatomi no Kane. Now, we talked about him before and during the war. He first showed up participating in ritual and speaking on kami matters. He would later rise to be one of the great ministers of state, and was one of the 6 ministers who had pledged themselves to Prince Otomo. At the end of the Jinshin War, he was put to death, and his family was banished. That said, in the period leading up to all of that, we spent a good amount of time with another Nakatomi, Nakatomi no Kamatari. He was the head of the Nakatomi clan and the Nai Daijin, the interior minister, a special position placing him on par or even above the ministers of the left and right, but which did not exactly have a well-defined portfolio that was noted in the literature. Interestingly, the position also doesn't seem to have survived Kamatari, at least in the short run. From the time of Nakano-Oe, aka Tenji Tenno, to the time of Oama, aka Temmu Tenno, it seems the office of Nai Daijin fell out of favor, possibly due in part to Prince Otomo being raised to a different post, that of Dajo Daijin, placing him in charge of the Great Council of State. The Nai Daijin role wouldn't be revived until 717 for Kamatari's grandson, Fujiwara no Fusasaki. Interestingly, that was only 3 years before the completion of the Nihon Shoki. Now, Nakatomi no Kane was, as far as we can tell, the brother to Kamatari. When Kamatari passes away, Kane seems to have taken the role as head of the Nakatomi family, and he was also made minister of the right. This mirrors in its way the relationship between Nakano-Oe and Oama, and the common system of inheritance that would often go brother to brother rather than father to son. And yet, while Kamatari was a hero of the Taika era, Nakatomi no Kane was executed for his role in the Jinshin War. So in the context of the rise of the Fujiwaras to greater prominence later on in Oama's reign, it is significant to me that Kamatari's line would be set apart from the rest of the Nakatomi to the extent of giving it the new Fujiwara name. Although the Chronicles claim the Fujiwara name was actually granted by Nakano-Oe, there is some thought that this was granted posthumously and may even have been retconned by later members of the family, possibly to distance themselves from Nakatomi no Kane and his role on the losing side of the Jinshin War, and They were then able to tie themselves more clearly to Kamatari and his founding role in Nakano-Oe's and Oama's new vision instead. And this all brings me to my next point: the creation of the national histories. The projects that culminated in what we know today as the Kojiki and the Nihon Shoki are said to have been started under Oama's reign, though they wouldn't be finished until much later, well into the 8th century. A lot of what went into them was work under Oama's wife, Uno, who succeeded him as Jito Tenno, as well as her successors. Now, Prince Toneri was son of Oama and the Princess Nitabe, one of Nakano-Oe's daughters, and while he never sat the throne himself, one of his sons would eventually do so. As such, we can see a strong royal hand on the project, even though the actual composition was probably by several teams of chroniclers. We touched on this briefly back in episode 131. The Kojiki, on the other hand, is said to have been written by Ono Yasumaro based on the oral history that had been maintained by Hieda no Are. We don't know much about Hieda no Are. There are some that believe they may have been a woman, since a passage in a later work, the Seikyuki, suggests that they were a member of the Sarume no Kimi family, descended from Ame no Uzume no Mikoto, who is said to have danced and helped lure Amaterasu out of the rock cave. And so they were particularly known for their role as shrine maidens, a particularly female role. That said, Are received the title of Toneri, which is often assumed to be a male title, and there's nothing else that explicitly says they were not. Either way, Hieda no Are is said to have been commanded by the sovereign Oama to memorize the history of the nation, presumably to then perform it as needed for the court. Only later was Ono Yasumaro asked to write it down in what became known as the Kojiki. Both of these chronicles were attempts to organize the history of the nation and to put together all the stories in a way that would establish a foundation for the new state that was evolving out of ancient Yamato. A large part of that effort was going to be to justify those who were in power at the time, including both the royal family and the various noble houses, including the powerful Fujiwara. Now, when we talk about how these histories were created to bolster the state, I do want to be careful. It may not have necessarily been the case that the chroniclers were actively and consciously promoting a fictional account in all places. I mean, from what we can tell, the chroniclers drew from a collection of stories, some written down in diaries and court records, works like the Baekje Annals and Continental Histories, and some that were likely just memorized tales that were part of the general culture. There were a couple of existing histories. We're told, for example, that there was a Teiki and a Kyuji floating around, both attributed to the legendary Shotoku Taishi, and both supposedly including the royal lineage at least to Toyomike Kashikiya Hime, aka Suiko Tenno. However, the copies that were being passed around were apparently suspect, and we're told that there were some inconsistencies. Now, this probably just means that the way they told the story did not conform to the way that Oama and the royal family wanted it told, or believed it should be told, though it could also refer to the fact that different accounts had slight variations on the stories, many of which had probably started as oral traditions and were later written down. It's also likely there was only so much detail in those ancient texts, but we can't know for sure. The Sendai Kuji Hongi purports to be the text of the original Kyuji, or Kyujiki, but that claim is dubious at best, though it may have used an older, no longer extant history, perhaps the Kyuji, to crib its own notes from. So there were probably some writings already, but there was also so much more. There were stories from various familial records, stories by various shrines about their kami and their histories, and stories passed down as local history that had never been captured previously. All of this was good material for the project of creating an official national history that aimed to tell the whole story. Now, to get an idea what the chroniclers of that time might have been going through, imagine you have some 2,000 random facts about the United States, or any country of your choice, in no particular order. Stories of heroes, presidents, wars, etc. On top of that, only a few of them ever give you any kind of reference dates, and when they do, those dates are only in relationship to the presidents in office, the third year of the presidency of Roosevelt, for example. Or maybe they reference another event. In addition, some of the facts have been lost, or they come from history books with a slightly different format. Or they come from diaries with different perspectives and takes on the same event. And then, without the aid of the internet or any other reference material, you are asked to put all of that together into a coherent narrative. In all likelihood, you would be able to generally construct many of the broad strokes. You would leverage what you know to be true and do your best to put things in place, but there's no guarantee that everything would be in the right order. And in places where there wasn't any clear through line, you may have needed to come up with your own best, most plausible explanation and write that down. Also, imagine you had, in the interest of completeness, thrown in some of the more, shall we say, apocryphal stories. George Washington cutting down a cherry tree, for instance, or the story of Johnny Appleseed, or even the more fantastical stories of Davy Crockett. Without other reference points, where would you know where they went, or how true they actually were? Add to all of that the lack of a referential calendar. The sexagesimal system helps for units of 60 years, but there was nothing comparable to a Western calendar in use at the time. Instead, everything was based on the number of years in a given reign. So instead of thinking about it as, did this happen in 584 or 524, it was more like, did this happen in the years of the sovereign reigning from X or Y palace? Now, that said, there do appear to have been individuals whose job was to memorize the stories and the histories and recite them. We have, for example, the Kamatari, the Guild of Storytellers. And it may have been out of this tradition that we get the eventual commission of the previously mentioned Hieda no Are, who was to memorize all the historical events and recite them back, which I can only imagine would have been a kind of performance for the court, helping to constantly reinforce the narrative history that the court wanted everyone to hear. But still, as Are was putting everything together, what were the assumptions and guidelines that they were working under? After all, there were no doubt certain truths, whether factual or not, that were pushed by the court. Things like the idea of an unbroken line of sovereigns going all the way back to the mythical founding, just like in the continental stories. Or the idea that worship centered from the beginning around the sun goddess, Amaterasu. There is plenty of evidence that while the early Wa people practiced various forms of sun worship, with traces found in their language as well as stories, cultural traditions, etc., it was not necessarily Amaterasu who was the primary deity of worship. Back in the Age of the Gods, we talked about the creator deities, Izanagi and Izanami, and about the high god of heaven, Takami Musubi, who seems to at one point have been the most prominent central deity, but who had since been eclipsed, if you will, by the likes of Amaterasu. We also see evidence that there were other sun deities. The language around Sarutahiko no Okami, for example, suggests that he may well have once been worshipped as a sun deity. And there's the early primacy of Mount Miwa as a place of worship and the spirit of O-Mono-nushi. This is to say nothing of O-Kuni-nushi and all of his stories up in Izumo. Furthermore, it seems telling that Amaterasu is not even central to the rituals conducted in the palace itself, which likely went back to an even earlier period. If Amaterasu were central and the ancestral kami of the royal family since its inception, one would expect that Amaterasu would also be central to the rites carried out by her descendants in the royal palace, and yet most of her worship appears to have continued to be set apart from the palace ritual and conducted out of Ise Shrine, albeit after a certain point ceremonially led by a designated female member of the royal line. Even Ise Shrine itself isn't the primary shrine in the Ise area. It's not the Ichinomiya, or most important provincial shrine of Ise, and that's said to be Tsubaki Shrine, which worships Sarutahiko no Okami and Ame no Uzume. So how did Amaterasu come to be so central in Oama's vision? There are stories that say that worship at Ise Shrine and worship of Amaterasu was specifically conducted by Oama's wife during the Jinshin campaign. This is to say, Oama's wife, primary consort, eventual queen, and then queen regnant, Uno, later known as Jito Tenno. Remember, Uno had fled with Oama and had been on the trail with him at first, but had stayed behind in Ise. Worship towards Ise seems to have later been counted as foundational to Oama and Uno's victory, and many suspect that they themselves may have subsequently encouraged greater worship of Amaterasu and placed her in the central position of sacral authority amongst the various kami. If so, that could explain why their histories focus so much on Amaterasu and her heavenly descendant, from which the royal line claimed direct lineage. It might also be around this time that the story of Iwarebiko, aka Temmu Tenno, and the conquest of Yamato from Himuka may have been introduced, telling how Iwarebiko justifiably took away the land from the descendants of Nigi Hayai, and then connecting Iwarebiko in an extremely loose fashion to Mimaki Iribiku no Mikoto, aka Sujin Tenno, the first sovereign according to the Nihon Shoki in its own way. Another influence on all this was likely the continental concept that time is more of a circle and history repeats itself. Chroniclers seeking to place events in a narrative context would have likely seen reflections of more recent events and used that to help order their compilation. And of course, if there were events that seemed to run counter to the truth as known by the court, well, those could all just be smoothed over. In this way, co-rulers were probably serialized. Inconvenient interim rulers may have been excised altogether, and different dynasties, which may have only had tenuous connections at best, were written down as direct lineal descendants. It also seems telling that the chroniclers may have reduced the role of what appears to be a matrilineal succession to a more patriarchal and patrilineal determination of legitimacy. Similarly, connections could be made for families to ancient ancestors through whom they were able to claim a certain proximity to the royal family. Likewise, rules for legitimacy could be imposed, or perhaps just assumed, for previous reigns, doing their best to bring them into harmony with the social norms and the cultural imaginaries of the late 7th and early 8th centuries. So that's the general context the chroniclers were working under. But at this point, it's illuminating to take a look at the two histories and how they differ to see what we can understand about where those differences came from. Now, the work of Hieda no Are, eventually recorded and written down as the Kojiki, seems to have dealt with history that was far enough back that it was likely hard to argue with. It isn't like there was anyone who could counter with their own facts, and the Kojiki reads as a fairly straightforward narrative, relatively speaking. Nihon Shoki, on the other hand, is a different beast altogether. While the Kojiki may have captured the official narrative, the Nihon Shoki seems to have been designed to include more, including some of the competing accounts. Thus, you'll get a lot of things like another source says with a different take on the same event. This is much more prevalent in the Age of the Gods, but still pops up occasionally throughout the rest of the text. Nonetheless, it is still very much focused on the royal line from Amaterasu down to Nakano-Oe and Oama. Even their posthumous names, Tenji and Temmu, specifically reference Ten, also pronounced Ama, at the start of their names, in what appears to be a bid to further connect them to the sun goddess of heavenly brightness, Amaterasu. Both of these works have their own character, and while the dates they were presented to the throne, 713 for the Kojiki, 720 for the Nihon Shoki, well, those suggest that they were published in succession, there are those that argue that the Kojiki is largely a reaction against the Nihon Shoki. So in all likelihood, the contents of the Nihon Shoki were known to many people before it was actually presented. There were groups of chroniclers involved after all, which meant teams of scribes pouring through sources, seeking out myths and legends, and generally trying to bring everything they could to the table. There's no indication that this was done in secret, so it is quite possible that the writers of the Kojiki had seen some of the early drafts and cribbed from those notes. Some of the ways that the histories differ are in their portrayal of certain accounts. For example, the Kojiki presents Iwarebiko and the pacification of Yamato and the archipelago more generally in terms of that mythical sovereign conversing with the spirits. And so he converses with, for instance, Omonunushi, the deity of Mount Miwa, a spirit whose name might be translated as the Great Lord of the Spirits, or Mono. This idea places the sovereign as an intercessor between mortal and the spirit world. It harkens back to an earlier system of sacral kingship, where power and authority came, at least in part, from supposed power of one's sacred sites and protective spirits. The Kojiki is also written in a much more vernacular style, using kanji and what we know of as man'yo-gana, the kanji used for their sound, rather than meaning, to provide a syllabary with which to write out Japanese words. This may have been done for similar reasons to why it was also used in the Man'yoshu itself, because the Kojiki was possibly meant to be recited aloud, not just read for meaning. The Nihon Shoki, in contrast, is clearly attempting to emulate the continental style. It relies much more heavily on not just the characters, but the grammar of Chinese, though not without its own idiosyncrasies. The Nihon Shoki incorporated classical references that mirrored the references found in the histories of the Tang and early dynasties. I suspect, for instance, that this is one of the main reasons that Nakatomi and Oama were given the posthumous names they were, Tenji and Temmu. Tenji means something like the wisdom of heaven, while Temmu is more like the martial virtue of heaven. This immediately brings to mind, for me, the continental concepts of Wen and Wu, culture and warfare, or Bunbu in Japanese. This even mirrors the founding Zhou kings, King Wen and King Wu. And later in the Han dynasty, you have Emperor Wu of Han, the grandson of Emperor Wen of Han. And Wu was considered to be one of the greatest emperors of the Han dynasty. So I can't help but think that there was a similar attempt at myth-making going on here, connecting those two reigns with the reigns of famous emperors of the continent. Of course, Wu was a popular name amongst the imperial dynasties from the Zhou dynasty onward, with emperors of Jin, Chen, Liang, and others all being given the same name. Now, this all accords with the way that the sovereign in the Nihon Shoki is less of a sacral king interceding and speaking with the kami, and more along the continental model of an absolute ruler who ruled by divine right and heavenly mandate. So if we continue to look at the Nihon Shoki's narrative, the lands outside of Yamato are subdued, and except for the occasional uprising, they stay subdued, or at least that's what the narrative would seemingly have us believe. Now, I would argue these distinctions are not absolute. The Kojiki contains plenty of concepts of imperial trappings, and the Nihon Shoki contains plenty of examples of the sovereign playing a more traditional role. But it is something to consider in the broad strokes of what they are saying, and I would argue that it also speaks to the duality of what was going on in this period. Clearly, the Ritsuryo state was built on the continental model, with an absolute ruler who ruled through a heavenly mandate, and yet, at the same time, we see Oama patronizing the traditional spiritual sites and kami worship, like the emphasis on Amaterasu and Ise Shrine. Besides the Kojiki and the Nihon Shoki, we have one more set of official records that were compiled just as the major histories were beginning to be finished. These were the Fudoki. The Fudoki were texts about various provinces, and they include information on the various places, population, soil quality, as well as various local myths and legends attached to those very things. Rather than supporting the royal lineage, the Fudoki were geared more towards supporting the process begun under Karu and Nakanoe of the Ritsuryo system, whereby knowledge of the archipelago was being centralized such that the state could know about its territories. Still, there are many times in the various Fudoki that we see references to different sovereigns, often to help situate a given event roughly within the historical narrative. The Fudoki were commissioned in about 713. At least 48 chronicles were said to have been compiled, but only a handful of them remain extant today. Most are only partial texts, though even those can still contain significant information. We also have purported text from certain Fudoki that were reprinted in later histories. The Shaku Nihongi, for example, seems to have been one such work, expressly commissioned to try and compile various older records that were likely aging and in danger of being lost altogether. However, there is a concern regarding just how faithful those later transcriptions might have been, meaning that we cannot rely on them entirely. Still, they are an invaluable addition to our study of the history of this period. I mention all of this because much of this period seems dedicated to remaking the nation of Yamato into what we know as Japan. This evolution didn't happen overnight, and it seems clear that it started gradually, but had now come to a head. There is some consideration, though, that many of the things attributed to early reigns, the work done by Shotoku Taishi, for example, or even that of Nakano Oe, may have been embellished in this period. After all, consider the difference between Oama trying to institute something entirely new versus him pointing back to a previous sovereign and claiming that, well, he wasn't innovating, he was just following the tradition. But there are still unmistakable signs of innovation in the following reigns. The creation of the first permanent capital city, for one. There was also the blending of Buddhist and local kami-based traditions. While Buddhism had been ascendant for a while now, we see Oama seemingly paying homage to Amaterasu and the local kami equally. Even while instituting newfangled continental ideas, he is also hearkening back to traditions that I can only imagine helped assuage some of the fears of any traditionalists who saw the rapid speed at which the archipelago was adopting at least the trappings of continental imperial culture. Speaking of culture, there was one other work that we should probably mention, and that is the famous Man'yoshu, the collection of 10,000 leaves. I mentioned this briefly earlier in this episode, but I do want to discuss it a bit because as much as we may glean from the official histories, as well as the various Fudoki texts, the Man'yoshu provides an invaluable view into the minds of the people of the time and contains some incredibly useful tidbits of information that, when put together, help give us a better idea of what was happening during this period. The Man'yoshu is a collection of more than 4,500 poems attributed to various historical figures from sovereigns such as Oama and Nakanoue to common soldiers. It is remarkable in that poems are largely in the native Japanese and are not using the Sinitic poetry styles that were popular with scholars of the time. These poems are waka, Japanese verse, which typically follows a pattern of repeating verses of 5-7-5 syllables or more, and then end with 2 lines of 7-7. The most simple of these are tanka, just one single top verse of 575 and then one bottom verse of 7-7. However, the poems in the collection can vary quite a bit. They are also remarkable in that they are written in what we know as Man'yo-gana. That is to say, they use Sinitic characters, kanji, but for their sound rather than meaning in many cases. This practice allowed for much more nuanced writing, such that the author could be more certain that the correct meaning could be taken away, since Japanese grammar differs greatly from various Chinese languages and leverages particles and suffixes that are non-existent in Sinitic script. Oftentimes, when reading something like the Nihon Shoki, one has to infer the Japanese word order, particles, and suffixes from the text as a whole. This is common with any kanbun, a very Japanese style of Chinese writing that often requires its own study to fully understand. Meanwhile, the Man'yo-gana allowed someone to more easily sound out the letters in the Man'yoshu. This must have been important when more or syllable count was important to the art form. Furthermore, it gives us tremendous insight into how spoken Japanese may have sounded back in the 8th century. And of course, it is great that we have all these poems, but almost more important is the other information contained in the collection. Most poems are not only attributed to a particular author, but they often give a brief introduction to lay out the circumstances in which the poem was composed. These poems are in many ways more straightforward than many later poetic styles, which relied much more heavily on so-called pillow words or poetic allusions or callbacks to previous poems. Not that they were completely devoid of such references, especially to other often continental works. Some poems are actually paired, a type of call and response. A man, for example, would often be expected to send a poem to a lady with whom he had recently had assignations, and she would often respond. Through such correspondences preserved in the poetic record, we can see various connections that may not be as clean in the historical texts. Now, 4,500 is a lot of poems, and I'll be honest, I am probably not going to be researching all of them for historical tidbits, but it is nonetheless important to understand. One should also be careful. While the poems are often attributed to various artists and famous persons, this may sometimes be misleading. The attribution may have been garbled or forgotten and recreated. Most of the poems in the Man'yoshu are presented with at least some amount of framing around them. They're grouped loosely by various themes. We are then told for each poem the composer and the occasion for which it was created. Sometimes this may be as simple as when they were out hunting, but that still gives us some context on which to go by as for why the author was writing the poem in the first place. The poems themselves vary in size. There are short poems or tanka, but also longer form choka poems with multiple verses. Some may allude to previous poems, but many of the poems are just about the author's feelings. Unlike haiku, they were not quite so prescribed in terms of pillow words or requisite seasonal descriptions. And yet, these poems, just as much as the histories, were important in capturing some part of the cultural zeitgeist from the time. We can see what was considered popular or important, and it was there for future generations down until today. Now, ultimately, of these three works, the Kojiki, the Nihon Shoki, and the Man'yoshu, well, the Kojiki would largely be overshadowed by the more comprehensive and prestigious-seeming history in the Nihon Shoki. The Nihon Shoki would become the official history inspiring future historical records, such as the Shoku Nihongi, the continuation of the records. The Man'yoshu, likewise, would be emulated with future compilations like the Kokinshu. These, in turn, would impact the cultural imaginary of the time. They would shape people's ideas about the past, about art, and even about the nature of the kami themselves. During this period, it is hard to understate just how much they were setting in place a new system. It's even difficult to tell how much of that system had actually been instituted by previous sovereigns, even though it's hard to tell how much had actually happened as opposed to simple claims by Oama and later Uno to justify what they were doing. Up to this point, the Ritsuryo state and the various reforms had been an experiment, but under Oama, we truly see that the new government upgrades would be fully installed. At the same time, we also see a shakeup in the court. Those who had been loyal to Oama during the Jinshin conflict of 672 received various rewards, increased rank and stipend for one thing. As famous individuals passed away, they were granted posthumous rank, which might not seem like much, but it increased the family's prestige and that of the individual's descendants without actually handing out a higher level of stipend that would be a drain on the coffers. All of this continued to build up the elite's reliance not just on the court, but on the throne itself for their status, wealth, and position. Thus, they had a vested interest in seeing that the project succeeded. And that is the world that we are about to dive into. Thank you. I know we didn't get into too much of the immediate history, and some of this is spoilers. After all, this took time, and in the moment, it could have turned out quite differently. What if Oama had gotten sick and died? What if there'd been a rebellion? What if Shilla or Tong had attacked? While we know what happened from the safety of our modern vantage point far in the future, it is important to remember that at the time, the people in the court didn't know what would happen next, so please keep that in mind. Next episode, we'll get to the actual events of the reign, starting with Oama's ascension to the throne at the newly built Kiyomihara Palace in Asuka. Until then, remember, if you like what we're doing, please tell your friends and feel free to rate us wherever you listen to podcasts. If you feel the need to do more and want to help us keep this thing going, we do have information on how you can donate on our Patreon or through our coffee site, ko-fi.com/Sengoku Daimyo, or find the links over at our main website, sengokudaimyo.com/podcast, where we will have some more discussion on topics from this episode. Also, please feel free to reach out to our Sengoku Daimyo Facebook page, or you can email us at thesengokudaimyo@gmail.com. Thank you also to Ellen for their work editing the podcast. And that's all for now. Thank you once again, and I'll see you next episode on Sengoku Daimyo's Chronicles of Japan.